I'm Paul Hampton, the Vice President of Certification for the LoRa Alliance, and I'd like to introduce to you Dave Smith, who will be our moderator this afternoon. Dave attended the University of California and the California State Polytechnic in Pomona, where he received his bachelor's degree in electrical and computer engineering. Dave has been the CTO at Multitech, Chief Digital Officer with Atom Beam Technologies, and is a Six Sigma Green Belt. You don't meet many of those, by the way. Today, Dave is the Vice President of IoT Solutions at Get Wireless and also the Chair of our Certification Committee with the LoRa Alliance. So, welcome, Dave. On our panel, we have David Tholl. Dave has been an RF engineer for most of his career. His formal education includes the University of Alberta and the University of Calgary. Dave has been an RF engineer with Novatel Communications, research assistant with TR Labs, and an RF engineer with Nortel Networks. Dave currently is a co-founder of the leading LoRaWAN manufacturer of network equipment, TEKTELIC. Welcome, Dave. Diego Bartolome. Diego has attended the University of Malaga, where he earned his master's degree in telecommunications engineering. Diego is a certified project management professional and is currently the Conformance Test Solutions Manager at DEKRA in Malaga, Spain, and has managed test tool development for a number of industry organizations, including the Open Connectivity Foundation, Personal Connected Health Alliance, the All Seen Alliance, and of course he is the project manager for the LCTT for the LoRa Alliance. So welcome, Diego. And last but not least, Gabriel Nave. Gabriel has received his bachelor's degree from UC Santa Barbara and has been in the telecom industry for most of his career. Gabriel has been an account executive with Allegiance Telecom, where he was responsible for wireless data sales and was a member of the Emerging Solutions Group within the Sprint Nextel Group. Gabriel was also Senior Director of Global Accounts for CalAmp Corporation. Gabriel is currently the Vice President of Business Development at Everynet, one of the world's largest LoRaWAN network operators. And Gabriel, in his spare time, also volunteers as a high school teacher at Harvest OPC, where he teaches weekly classes based on his own curriculum. So welcome, Gabriel. With that, I'll hand it over to Dave Smith, and we'll start our session.
Thank you, Paul. We'll try not to hold any of that past stuff against us, okay? As you see, we have an operator, we have a device manufacturer, and we have an authorized test house representative. And we're going to be talking about deploying devices in the field and what you can do to reduce the risk, the cost, and the effort of being successful with that. Does that make sense? So I'm going to start out with a question for all the panelists. Hopefully you will each have a completely different perspective. When we're deploying LoRaWAN devices out in the field, do you see a difference in devices as they get deployed? And I don't mean, temperature versus pressure, that kind of thing, but manufacturers, and especially regarding certification. Do you see differences in effort or time or cost associated with that? And whichever one of you would like to go first would be great.
I'll start as close as, yes. Oh, sorry, okay. You asked a closed-ended question, you get a closed, this is an engineering crowd, right?
Yes.
So I have to give a closed answer, is that right? No. Yeah, I mean, we could expand a lot on the various categories of differences, and particularly there's continuity. I spent 20 years in the cellular IoT space, and there's continuity between cellular and LoRaWAN in terms of firmware and design challenges that we see. Things deployed they're congruous, similar to that, and some that are specific to LoRaWAN in terms of how well the devices we see actually conform to the standard.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give a really basic example. We see devices that don't properly join because they don't follow the standard join process, so they can only join to certain channels and not to others, for example.
So they'll have difficulty getting on the network.
They'll have difficulty getting on the network depending on how that network is architected and what its requirements are for channel planning.
I've heard about zombie devices that will join a network, and then we've talked about them in the technical committee, right? And those devices have some sort of flaw in their firmware, in their compliance. Okay, thank you, Gabriel. How about you, Diego?
Well, from the certification point of view, the different verticals really don't affect too much to the type of testing, because obviously you are going to certify in the same way if you are implementing or your customer is implementing a light sensor or a water sensor or something like that. Sometimes maybe what is different is the activation process, because sometimes because of the final destination of the sensor, one typical issue is that the device doesn't send a join request or send only a join request every day or something like that, and obviously you cannot connect from the test tool. Maybe the activation is the only difference on the way from verticals, but the type of testing is essentially the same. Obviously, if you don't enter into the Class A, Class B, or Class C, obviously in that point, some sensors, depending on mostly on the power supply possibilities. If you have to use batteries, obviously you have to operate in Class A, and you will have to pass some test cases for Class A. If you are in Class B, because of you can work with beaconing and well, you are battery supply, but you can afford some extra energy on the beaconing process. You will have obviously more agility on sending and receiving measurement, but if definitely you are a Class C, you cannot be battery powered. So
Yeah, and activating, remember, affects every device, right? So if you deploy 10,000, you have 10,000 problems, right? If that happens at that level. How about you, Dave?
Well, I guess representing the manufacturer of devices, the buck stops with us. We have to produce devices that are solid in terms of LoRaWAN performance. Certification definitely helps us with that. The LCC tool, we're also responsible for the application. If that device is intended to measure temperature, we have to make sure it does a good job measuring temperature. That's why it's there. We always have commitments on battery life. We got to make sure we have strong battery life as we advertise. We have to make sure that our RF performance is good as well, that it works in areas that you expect to deploy it in. So we do take that responsibility. There's no one behind us. We can't look over our shoulder. If there is a problem, I would expect my colleagues to call me and say, your device is having a problem, and we'd work through it. It is nice to have something like the LCTT and a certification committee, a certification protocol, to have one of those pillars have a referee on. We can say, we have gone through certification, we have used the LCTT, our device is behaving in a known manner. It's still there. Unfortunately, LoRaWAN hasn't ironed out all the wrinkles. Certainly in 1.02, there was some unclear areas where some devices behave differently. And once you're in one of those spots, we have to work forward as a team. So maybe it's something has to be changed in the gateway configuration to allow those devices to work. Maybe it's something, like if you have 10,000 devices out there, one option is to take them all back. That's always a painful option, right? It would be much nicer if you could remotely configure the gateways or the networks in a change to move forward. And that's why we like to think of this as a partnership, an ecosystem, so we all try to work together to move those things forward.
It's funny you keep using that number 10,000, because that's the number I use, that you never actually know all the bugs you have in your firmware until you have 10,000 devices in the field. It doesn't matter how much you do your 100 device test or your 1,000 device test, until you have 10,000, you don't know what's wrong.
Right. So I'm going to follow up with Dave then again. As an OEM, you know, we have the LCTT, the LoRaWAN Certification Test Tool. It's a mouthful. But it's the tool that both the authorized test houses and device manufacturers will use to certify devices. Your engineers use those? Does it work well for them? Does it give you valuable information?
We've been using the LCTT pretty regularly for about a year now. So we've been convinced of the value of the LCTT and the certification program. So we're moving in that direction at TEKTELIC. So yes, we do use the LCTT. It does have a learning curve. It took us a while, but it was worthwhile, I would say that. So thank you, I'll say. As a member of the LoRa Alliance, it's one of the benefits we've got is a tool. We can set up our gateway in the lab and run through all the test cases and know how we will perform when we get to the authorized test house.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
The LCTT is set up to be run by a device manufacturer, and when you pass, you're pretty sure you're going to pass at the test house because the test house is running the same tool in the same kind of environment, right? Is that correct, Diego?
Yeah, that's correct, and I fully agree that the LoRa Alliance has made a very important effort and a very good job on providing this certification test tool to all members, because as you say, if you pass the test cases with LCTT on your house, you are pretty sure that you are going to pass in the authorized test lab. That was not happening at the beginning of the certification program when obviously members didn't have any help, any support. They didn't have any tool. In fact, in that moment in DEKRA, we were having some internal tool, but even we were requested by the LoRa members interested in certifying in the test house. They were interested in getting that test tool in advance. And they asked us, okay, could you please allow me to use the tool to do the debugging before going to the lab? Because obviously for a test house, you are not interested in spending 2 weeks debugging the product with your customers. You are also interested on receiving a device that is passing most of the test cases. Obviously, if one test case is not passing, the test house is going to support you to pass the test case. I think it's going to provide information and to teach you and to help you to fix the problem. But obviously, it's better if you have the tool. So, coming to the initial question, I think the LCTT is a very useful test tool, and it's a proof that you are going to pass the certification. We are, in my case, as Paul said at the beginning, I've been involved in the IoT industry since many years. I've been involved in Bluetooth SIG, in CSA, Connectivity Standard Alliance, and producing Zigbee test tools. Also in Continua Health Alliance and producing healthcare test tools. So I'm pretty familiar with the testing, with the conformant testing. We were working also for WiMAX, for Wi-Fi. So we have a deep knowledge on conformant test tool, and we are adding all that knowledge to the LCTT, and we are trying to provide a very comprehensive test tool. We know that the conformant testing is not an easy task, so we are receiving in Maxilla and in the test in the platform to receive to report backs for the LCTT. We receive many comments, or in the certification committees, or in the different sessions, we receive comments to improve the user interface and the user experience. And obviously, we are trying to add all those comments to the test tool, but obviously a conformant test tool sometimes is not an easy test tool because you are testing a protocol and you are not using a mobile app just to...
And the protocol is changing.
And that's the major challenge, yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick on you now,
All right.
Gabe. As an operator, do you see differences in devices that are certified or not and the amount of issues you have with them? And just to warn you, I need more than a yes or no.
There goes the yes or no question out the window. Well, I mean, yes, and I don't know what your follow-up questions are to that, but the example I gave earlier of something that doesn't join properly to the network is a good one. There's a number of other places where we see differences. You know, as an operator, we don't always know what devices are going on the network. It's the nature of LoRaWAN that it's not like in cellular where you have an off key that is tied and it's connectioned there. And so we see devices that are challenged in other ways, and some of them have passed certification, and that's a problem. You know, that's a different set of problems.
I remember talking, Vitaly is the CTO of Everynet, and I remember talking with him one time, and there were some devices that had a slight variance from the spec on the receive window timing. Now, it's really low-level technical thing, but to receive something from the network, the specific times you need to be listening, and it was slightly off. And so you would get a device that half the time wouldn't be listening in time and get something down from the network. And I know that was an issue because we fixed it. That's tested in the LCTT, right? So that's kind of one example.
It's a good example.
Okay.
We also, you know, find beyond one of the challenges, and this is true, I've found in all wireless testing, is you have compliance to the specification, and then there's the use, does it do everything else it's supposed to do questions. And I mean, you mentioned temperature monitoring. One classic use case that I've seen multiple times is devices that do temperature monitoring, and they do all the testing on the device in an open case with the board level doing in the test to make sure that the device is reporting the right temperature, and then you seal the case in an IP67 enclosure, and it raises the internal temperature multiple, 3, 4, 5 degrees, which even a couple of degrees doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're at the upper end of a variance for FSMA compliance, all of a sudden you're reporting something out of spec and you're wasting a lot of food.
So I'm trying to make sure we have a few minutes for questions. So I've got one final big question for the whole panel. So, and it involves interoperability. Today, the tool that we use, the LCTT, it tests for compliance or conformance, depending on how you want to say it. In other words, does the device follow the spec? But interoperability is a much larger and broader topic, where does this device work with this gateway and this network server and perhaps this application? What are your thoughts regarding the interoperability, the viability and the need for interoperability testing to make sure your deployments go simpler and smoother? You can go first.
I'll jump in. So TEKTELIC tries to make most of the pieces of the infrastructure in LoRaWAN. So we strive for interoperability. We try to partner with everyone. And I think it's interface by interface. Network servers to gateways is one interface. We are, as an alliance, working towards standardizing that and having that's written down, and then people can conform to it. I think the LoRa MAC devices through gateways to the network server is well specified. The technical spec, the link layer is solid, and the LCT tool does a good job of that. And then you're inside the network server is the next piece, which luckily is all, like the gateways are all connected to the network, so easy to upgrade, and you can continually improve your software as you find issues. You can make improvements and deploy them 90% of the time, 99% of the time without touching that gateway. You can go correct things, right? The goal is to get that to 100%, so you never have to touch a gateway once it's deployed. You can remotely manage it, configure it, and update it. And the same is true for the network servers. The majority of those are based in the cloud, and they're constantly being updated and constantly being improved. So I think you have to focus on the areas where it's hardest to make those improvements, because we are a growing and maturing ecosystem, and we're going to be continuing to do that over the next years. So that is the end devices, and that's why we're becoming more and more a larger participation in the certification aspects, so we can make sure those end devices are solid and the hardest to touch and make them the most robust.
So if I heard you right, the LoRa ecosystem has a good base in terms of the specifications for making sure things interoperate, and then being able to test that and ensure that is going to be important.
Yeah, as time goes by. And I think we have the right focus to start at the device and build back towards the less easily upgraded devices. Or the more easily, we'll move back up to the things that can be more and more easily upgraded.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I think this is the point when you told me I was supposed to rip my microphone off and throw it on the ground and
Yeah.
storm out.
Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
I have to run, but to exit early, but I did want to, I think that the interface by interface is exactly the right approach, and getting devices conformed to the certification first is absolutely the most important piece to do. And then the timing issues, especially when we start dealing with Class B, and then you're dealing with the device to the network server, sometimes out to application server. That gets the Class B device
I
stuff
think
is
that
still very, very
interoperability
tricky.
for an operator, where
Yeah.
you're trying to bring it all together, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to connect the end device all the way through the application, and it's always your fault, is important. Our panelist has to leave early, so I apologize. I jokingly told him to rip his mic off and throw it down and storm off for a little drama, but, okay, Diego, how about you? Interoperability.
Yeah, the IOP or the IOP testing or interoperability testing is the next step on a certification program after completing the conformance testing, which is mainly focused on protocol testing or functional testing, because in the LCTT we have some functional testing as well, not only protocol testing. So once you have that in your certification program, and you are pretty sure that the devices are fulfilling the baseline for the conformance, the next step is the IOP testing. So you need to be sure that the different optional parameters, because you have many parameters and many features in a protocol that are not always mandatory. And if you have a device implementing some optional parameter and other that or the network server that is not considering that parameter and receive that, or vice versa, you can have interoperability issues. So I think it's a very good idea, totally necessary, because if you want to ensure the real operation on deployments without any problem, you cannot rely only on conformance and protocol testing. You cannot rely only on that. You need the IOP testing, and that's then a very good decision by LoRa Alliance to create this working group and to start creating the IOP testing as well.
Yes, and we actually have a separate interoperability work group within the certification committee solely focused on getting that done. And we hope to have an event later this year where we will have people come with different equipment and do interoperability testing between devices and gateways and network servers. So I'd like to open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
I was just, once you've already deployed and it's working, do you ever have issues with staying connected, and what might those be?
So say that again.
Do you ever have issues with devices or sensors where they randomly just disconnect after you've successfully deployed, after like a month, maybe part of the sensors are working, and how would you fix that?
Jump in, Diego?
So he's asking about a deployed sensor that initially works.
No,
and then
I understand. Well, we are not obviously making any deployment. We in DEKRA are focused on the test tool, but we know that from the certification committee regular meetings that sometimes some devices on real deployments has any kind of issue related to disconnection and also the zombie devices you were mentioning, and that's why we decided, for example, to create the backup test case. And the backup test case is just a test case. It's a pretty long test case. It's a 35 hours test case that is going, the intention of this test case is just to check that the backup mechanism on a device is working properly, and a device cannot flood the network without with sending messages and obviously saturating the network.
But from a device manufacturer standpoint, how do you handle your devices anticipating failures in the field, or do you?
I think it's an excellent question, right? Because this can happen. Something can change in that network. You are working fine, someone moves a gateway, all of a sudden you're out of coverage, or you're a little bit stranded. So you have to anticipate that as the standard body. The standard body has something called ADR backoff, adaptive data rate control. If a device doesn't think it's in communication with the network, it will gradually lower its data rate, choosing more and more robust data rates, maximizing its transmit power, trying to establish connectivity again. At the end of that process, it's operating at the most strong data rate, the highest transmit power. Then it's, depending on the regions, there's a whole bunch of places in the world LoRaWAN can operate. It will try to concentrate its operation on the default channels, the ones that the network is obligated to cover, and see if it can reestablish connection. As an absolute last resort, that device could try to join again would be and the newer and newer standards have introduced even rejoining, a very specific process that is enabled to reestablish these connections. Join again is kind of a harsh, because you give up on the one that has been working for you and you try to establish a new session. Rejoining, you can kind of have both alive and have a chance on both. So join again is sort of a last resort in the LoRaWAN 1.0 set of standards, but it is a good behavior as a last resort.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Okay, let me talk about some things that are coming up with certification. We've talked about end devices. There is a network server to gateway technical spec that's going to be published. So we will now be testing gateways for compliance as well once that gets published. And then there is what they call the back-end interface spec, and there's actually several of those that have been published. And what we're planning on doing is moving towards testing those. They're generally cloud entities themselves, so that when we have compliance tests for all those layers, then when we put on top the interoperability tests, we should hopefully guarantee that you can grab any device with any gateway and any network server, and it should work. That's the goal. Hopefully we'll achieve that. Does that kind of spur any questions from people? Or did I just bore you?
It's important. We just don't know what question to ask yet.
Is it important?
Incredibly important.
Yes, we think it is, for sure. And, it was really thanks to Paul a lot for the big push for interoperability. He's been the big champion for that internally. Yes, sir.
So we've been in situations, we're a device provider, and we've been in situations, as I'm sure you have, where, well, you may not have, we have had to deploy on different people's networks. And it's a network for the device guy because they all fail in unique and surprising ways. And so having a spec that defines interoperability would be huge for us. At the end of the day, as we're set up here, if we're not successful in front of the customer, nothing works, and the customer is not happy.
You're exactly right. And in fact, one of the questions I was going to ask you, Diego, is, but I don't think we have the time, we're running out now, but was what are the kinds of failures you see when devices are getting tested, right? And one of the things we've added to the LCTT that I will mention for you is in a very anonymous way, we're not sharing any private data, but when you run the LCTT and you test it against a device, any failure messages, they're anonymized, and then they get sent so that we can analyze and see where are devices that are being tested, where are they failing, right? And we're using that as feedback to the technical committee to hopefully make any improvements or changes that might need to be made. So far, we haven't found any, but we've seen a lot of consistent errors, which is good because that helps people who are deploying in the field as well, right? If we know what typical errors are and you see them in the field, you hopefully have a typical solution for it to make it simple. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're about a month and a half into that data collection, and probably the biggest errors we're seeing are user errors, which I think is good. But we're hoping over time, as we collect more and more data, we start seeing some trends that can help us not only improve the spec, but also improve our test tool and improve the process for certification as well.
Can I answer, or give this guy an answer to the question?
Yeah.
We've had devices disconnect for no apparent reason, and when we delete the session keys and the head end, and it creates a new session, sometimes they'll rejoin.
Okay, fantastic, thanks.
Yeah, Well, thank-
Answering
say?
to your question, Dave, the most typical issue on certification depend on the LoRaWAN spec, but the LoRaWAN spec 102 has been tested for many years because the LCTT, the initial scope of the LCTT in 2019, I think, was the first official
about 3
release
years
of the
ago.
LCTT, 2019, and the scope was based on 102, and the most typical issue was related to the lack of 224 handling implementation. So for 102, you need to send the certification information under the certification protocol or under the port 224, and obviously you need to implement that in the firmware in order to listen on the 224 port, all the conformant testing, and that was the most typical issue that devices were not implemented that.
And that's what the data showed.
Yeah, so what he's talking about is the firmware of a device not being implemented in a way that it can be tested.
Exactly. It's a kind of test mode. It's
But-
not exactly a test mode, but very similar.
I think we kind of ran over our time, but we will all be hanging around here if you have any other questions. But other than that, thank you very much for your attention. We really appreciate it.